most of the patients had very positive experiences, and also had tended to have a sort of shift in their paradigm, a shift in their thinking and in their perspective on their drinking, to the point that the subjects who were given LSD tended to do a little better in terms of remaining abstinent than the people who didn't. 1960 came along, and Cohen at UCLA published a safety paper on LSD. They looked at 5,000 subjects who collectively had taken 25,000 trips. So some pretty good numbers. Per 1,000 LSD ingestions, there were 1.8 psychotic episodes, 1.2 attempted suicides, and 0.4 completed suicides. Those numbers led Cohen to declare LSD an astonishingly safe drug, and that opened the doorway to more human clinical experimentation. One of the most well-known experiments is the Good Friday experiment. It was conducted in 1962 by Walter Pahnke. He took 20 theology students who were psychedelic naive, who'd had mystical experiences in their past at some point. He split them into two groups. 10 of them received psilocybin, a pretty healthy dose, and 10 got an active placebo. They got nicotinic acid, which, if given at a high enough dose, causes some tingling and some physical sensation, but isn't, as far as I know, a psychedelic. Gave them the psilocybin and active placebo in a very supportive religious setting. They actually did this in a church. And when all was said and done, 4 out of the 10 people in the psilocybin group had had a mystical experience that day, whereas none in the placebo group had a mystical experience. Later on in 1991, Rick Doblin of MAPS did a follow-up study and talked to most of the people who'd been involved in the Good Friday experiment. And it turns out that most of them from that day had had long-term benefit. Either it had changed some aspect of their relating to God, or or their conception of their religion. And none of the people who received psilocybin had any long-term negative effects. Next was the Concord prison experiment, also pretty well known in the literature. This was run by Tim Leary in 1961 through 63. What he did was he did psilocybin-assisted group therapy with prisoners, and his goal was to reduce recidivism. So what they did, they had 12 group sessions over 6 weeks, and for 2 of those sessions, the prisoners received psilocybin. I think also the facilitators took psilocybin. Research was a little different back then. But Leary, in his paper, reported significant improvement in the prisoners' recidivism rates. But later on, again, Rick Doblin did a long-term follow-up study and found that the improvement wasn't as great as Leary had said, and was in fact non-significant statistically. And finally, we come to the Spring Grove experiments. Spring Grove was a state hospital in Maryland, or is a state hospital in Maryland. I actually went to their website, and they had a history of Spring Grove from its, they founded it back in 1600, 1700, and there was no mention of Stan Groff and Walter Pahnke doing these LSD experiments in their hospital. I can't imagine not wanting to talk about this in public. But anyways, so Walter Pahnke and Stan Groff and others in 1963 started the Spring Grove experiments. These were NIMH funded. They received $4 million to conduct these experiments. They gave LSD to alcoholics and addicts, and that of course was based on Osmond and others' experiences with using LSD in treatment of addictions. They also gave it to neurotics and terminal patients. Now, with those last 2 groups, an endpoint is difficult to define, but in the addicts, they did see a significant reduction in relapse rates. The same kind of work continued at both Spring Grove and at the Maryland Psychiatric Research Institute until it finally shut down in 1977. And now we talk about psychedelic prohibition. As I've said before, in '62, Congress started putting restrictions on LSD. This looks like something that they should control a little bit. In 1966, Senate hearings were actually held, and as a result of those, the FDA instituted further restrictions on use and research with LSD. And then in that same year, LSD was made illegal in California. In '68, they stiffened penalties for having LSD, using LSD. And in 1970, that saw the birth of the Comprehensive Drug Abuse Prevention and Control Act, the Part 2 of which was the Controlled Substances Act, and the schedule system, which you all, well, most of you probably know about, Schedule 1 through 5. Schedule 1 being substances that have no therapeutic or research potential, and without much thought, psychedelics and marijuana were put into Schedule 1. It seems to me that a lot of the decision-making around that time was based on hysteria and fear rather than looking at the available scientific evidence, which of course was still preliminary at that time. But to sort of just take a hatchet to all the work that was going on in research circles, it seemed a little bit like an overreaction, at least in hindsight and from my perspective. Maybe we can talk about that later. So between 1970 and 1990, most legitimate work with psychedelics was done as bench work and as animal research. And like I said, a lot of the decision-making, a lot of the thinking at the time was based on fear and some irrationality. And as a result, there were several myths regarding LSD use and LSD and health. Things like chromosome damage. This hit the front pages when a study suggested that there might be a link between LSD and chromosome damage. All over the media, that LSD causes irreversible damage to people's genome. 1 or 2 years later, more detailed, better designed studies came out and showed almost indisputably that LSD was not responsible for chromosome damage, and that wasn't reported nearly as much as the initial report that LSD was responsible. So chromosome damage doesn't happen. Same thing with leukemia. There was at one point a link hypothesized between certain kinds of leukemia and LSD. That again never really happened, wasn't true. There was a story out, an urban myth, about two young college students who took LSD and then stared at the sun until they went blind. I think it was sometime in the mid-'70s that a politician in Pennsylvania came clean and said that he made that story up to scare kids out of not doing drugs. So again, not true. I think we've all, or most of us, have heard the story about children's tattoos being laced with LSD, so be careful when you go out on Halloween, and if anybody gives you one of those lick-em-stick-em tattoos, you better throw it away. Once again, there's been not one reported incidence of this ever happening. And finally, there's rumors, particularly among college students, that strychnine is somehow involved in the manufacture of LSD, that it's either required to kick LSD into your system or that it's needed to keep LSD sticking to the blotter paper. There was one report of a batch of LSD being adulterated with strychnine, but that was powdered LSD. There's never been a case of blotter acid being contaminated with strychnine. So again, that's something of an urban myth amongst users. Oh. How do I get back to that? There we go. For those of you who can't read it, it says, "Sorry, son, but for you to understand what happened, you have to first understand that back in the 60s, we were all taking a lot of drugs." So now you know that's not true. So now we'll talk about some of the more recent work that's been done. Psychedelic research is gradually coming back. In Switzerland, between '88 and '93, Bloch et al. Did a retrospective study with 171 subjects looking at MDMA and LSD-assisted psychotherapy, because these are legal modalities of treatment in that country. In 1996, Spitzer looked at the cognitive effects of psilocybin and found that it increased indirect semantic priming. In '98, in Germany, Hermle et al. Looked at blood flow and cerebral laterality with mescaline. And finally, in '99, Guzoulis, Mayfrank et al. Looked at the neurometabolic effects of psilocybin and some other drugs in healthy volunteers. There are currently projects in progress or under development. Kurland at Baltimore is looking at using LSD in the treatment of cancer patients. This project is currently on hold at the FDA.